Hello, and thank you for joining us for Turning 18, What Families Need to Know, Assisting Young Adults with Disabilities, Public Benefits Programs. My name is Ashley Greenberg, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kate Lehner. We are attorneys with Northwest Justice Project and the Medical Legal Partnership. The Medical Legal Partnership is a collaboration between Northwest Justice Project, where Kate and I work as attorneys, Seattle Children's Hospital, and Harborview Medical Center. The purpose of the Washington Medical Legal Partnership is to improve patient health through legal advocacy on non-criminal legal issues. Among other work that the MLP does, we offer presentations like today's presentation on the legal transition to adulthood for young people with disabilities. During this presentation today, we will cover a number of topics. We're focusing on public benefits programs and financial planning for young adults with disabilities. This presentation does not cover decision-making options like guardianship and powers of attorney for young people with disabilities who are turning 18. For a link to that presentation, as well as many other resources for families with young people with disabilities who are turning 18, please refer to the resources slide at the end of this presentation. We will talk about those resources when we present that slide. Please be aware that the information we're giving in this presentation is current as of February 2024 when we are recording this presentation. However, programs and laws change regularly, and so we ask that you check to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information. There are hyperlinks in various slides throughout this presentation. A PDF version of this PowerPoint is available on the webpage where you found this video, and you can click on the hyperlinks in that PDF of these slides. Also, finally, please be aware that while we are providing resources and general legal information today, this presentation does not constitute legal advice. So our first set of topics we're going to cover today are public benefits programs that your young adult may be eligible for. The first benefits program we're talking about is the Washington State Developmental Disabilities Administration, or DDA. So what is it? It's services that are not paid for by Medicaid or health insurance that allow people with qualifying disabilities to live safely in community-based settings. Generally, the purpose of DDA and DDA services is to support Washingtonians with intellectual and developmental disabilities to live the lives they want to live and to be able to live in the community and in community-based settings.
Ashley, we often get questions about the difference between services that are provided by Medicaid and services provided by DDA. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. That's a great question. So Medicaid, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes, is health insurance. And so it pays for things that your medical providers prescribe for you or think are medically necessary. So that can include everything from, let's say, prescriptions to medical equipment or therapies like speech therapy, ABA therapy, occupational therapy, those sorts of things. DDA's services are different than these. DDA's services are not quote unquote medically necessary like those covered by Medicaid, but they are provided because they enrich the lives of people with disabilities, keep them safe, or allow them to keep on living at home or in a community-based setting. So examples are things like the examples provided there, like employment supports, respite for unpaid care providers, environmental modifications like a ramp leading up to the home, something like that, communication devices or residential supports, meaning that there are some community-based residences where certain people on DDA may be able to live, those sorts of things. It is helpful to know that DDA does administer some Medicaid services for some certain people, like we'll talk about in a little bit, that for in-home care, some people who are on DDA actually access in-home personal care through DDA, even though it's a Medicaid service, so it can get a little bit confusing. But that's generally the distinction, which is Medicaid is kind of medical services, and DDA is really keeps people with intellectual and developmental disabilities safe and able to live their fullest lives in the community. So this slide lists the DDA eligibility requirements. So to summarize the basic eligibility requirements, first, someone must have a qualifying diagnosis, which includes intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, and then certain other similar or related conditions. The condition must have originated before age 18, though for certain conditions, it has to have originated even earlier. It must be expected to last indefinitely. And then, in addition to all of those, the condition itself must result in substantial limitations. And this is usually demonstrated by test scores such as an IQ score plus what is called adaptive scores from certain types of adaptive testing, showing how someone's kind of functioning and getting along in the home or their world. Note that, like we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, rules and programs are constantly changing. And one change that we know is on the horizon for DDA eligibility is that starting in July 2025, DDA will no longer be using IQ as part of in the way that it does right now in DDA eligibility determinations. We aren't quite sure what the new eligibility criteria or process will look like for DDA, but that's just something to keep in mind. Kate, now I'd like to turn to you and ask you a couple of questions about eligibility. Specifically, I have questions about the impact of family income on DDA eligibility and also immigration status on DDA eligibility. Can you address those?
Yeah, so first, with regard to income, it's important to know first that DDA eligibility is based on disability. It's not based on income, but it is true that certain of the programs, some of the kind of more robust programs, such as including the waiver programs, are based on income, but they only look at the income of the person with disabilities, not the family's income. And that is true both for children and for adults. So that's something to keep in mind. As far as immigration goes, DDA includes many programs or services that are funded by federal Medicaid. And federal Medicaid has has immigrant eligibility restrictions. So some people either might not be eligible for those services at this time because of their status, or they might be in a 5-year wait period, which applies to many immigrants. But it's still important to establish eligibility for DDA services as soon as possible, both because there's more documentation and evidence available often when people are younger, but also that means that once that person becomes eligible for Medicaid, the transition for those more robust Medicaid funded services will be smoother.
Thanks, Kate. Now we're going to turn to the topic of DDA waivers, which is a term that you may have heard of. So what happens is if you are found eligible for DDA, that just means that you are eligible for the DDA program. And generally, you do not get many services just by being kind of DDA eligible and being part of the DDA program. Instead, there's sort of a second level of assessment and eligibility for what are called waivers. There are 5 waivers in Washington state, and each waiver has basically kind of a menu of services that people who are enrolled on that waiver can access. So that includes all of the things that we talked about on that first slide about DDA, like the employment supports, the residential services, the environmental modifications, that sort of thing. They're kind of like these waivers have these different packages of services with different funding levels and things like that for people who are enrolled on that waiver. However, that does not happen automatically. So once you are eligible for DDA and you're on DDA, it's really important then to ask to be assessed for a waiver. And the DDA case manager should do what is called a functional assessment, which is basically figuring out what is the level of need that you have for DDA services, and then seeing, is there a waiver that's kind of the best fit in terms of your assessed level of need. Something important to know though is there's only a certain number of DDA waivers that are available, kind of each of those 5 types. And so even if you are eligible, you're found functionally eligible for one of the waivers, you might still be placed on a wait list for that waiver, and you might need to wait until enough other people kind of go off that waiver so that you can go on the waiver. A couple other notes. It's good to know that in-home personal care services, which we will discuss in a few minutes, is one of those services that you do not need to be on a waiver to be assessed for or to receive. So even if you're not on a waiver, if you need in-home personal care services, you can ask to be assessed for it. And then the final note is that if you're on a DDA waiver, you are also automatically eligible for Medicaid, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which is another really good reason to get onto a DDA waiver. So here's the link to the DDA application on the DDA website, as well as a lot of other really good information about the program and about applying. And then Kate, I'd like to turn to you now, because you and I know when we've given this presentation in the past, and also when we're just talking to families, a lot of families do have questions about if their young adult who is turning 18, who has disabilities, may have difficulty, for instance, filling out the application themselves, understanding certain elements of kind of bureaucracy and programs and things like that. You know, we hear from families a lot, as well as from medical providers, oh, does this person need guardianship in order to apply for these programs, or for DDA to share information with parents or other trusted adults? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and yeah, we definitely get asked about that a lot. And the good news is that no, you do not need guardianship to help an adult apply, if even if they're not able to apply on their own behalf. So there are regulations that apply to DDA, and those regulations say that certain relatives who live with a person and who are primarily responsible for that person's care can help that person apply, and also more broadly, other adults, if the person is just unable to do the application on their own because of their medical condition. We did include that Washington Administrative Code section there. And just so people know the background, state agencies are required to promulgate these types of regulations that talk about their duties and your rights and so forth. So you can look that up. If you have a problem, you can look that up and you can talk about it and explain, hey, this is what the regulation says. The other thing to be aware of is that for DDA clients who are over 18, DDA will send copies of notices to the client themselves, but the regulations also say that they should send notices to a person who's been identified by the DDA client as another person who should get copies of those notices. So that will usually be a parent or another family member. And we also included that Washington Administrative Code section. Now, do be aware, though, that if a family member is trying to consent to specific services, on behalf of the DDA client, then DDA may ask for additional authority, which could include a durable power of attorney. If the person is able to understand that basic idea of I'm going to sign this to allow someone else to make decisions for me or communicate decisions for me and so forth.
Thanks so much, Kate. So now we're turning to our next topic, which is Medicaid, called here in Washington State, Washington Apple Health. What is it? It's free or low-cost health insurance for people who meet eligibility requirements. And just as an example of some of the covered services, what it means, what health insurance or Medicaid covers is things like primary care from your doctor, emergency room visits, maternity services, pediatric care, dental services, and prescription medications. And then also things like therapies, like the speech therapy or ABA or occupational therapy that we were talking about before. It can cover a whole range of things. Something else that is really good to know is that Medicaid can also be secondary insurance, meaning if a young person, and when we see this most often, but let's say that a young person is continuing to be covered by their parents' health insurance through an employer up through age 26, they can also be on Medicaid as secondary, meaning like backup insurance at the same time. And that can be really good for a number of reasons. So it's in some instances, Medicaid might actually cover services that the primary insurance does not, or Medicaid could also pay for additional services like additional therapy visits or something like that. If the primary insurance has a specific number of visit limits in a year, like let's say like 12 visit limits or something like that in a year, then Medicaid can actually kick in as secondary and cover the rest of what a young person needs throughout that year. So it can be really helpful to have both at the same time. So you'll see there the website wahealthplanfinder.org. That is the website to apply for Medicaid. We often tell people, be aware, there are a lot of kind of copycat scam websites that are very similar to wahealthplanfinder.org, but that is the only one which is legitimate. So make sure that you're going to the right website. And then also to know, at that same website, you can also find a link if, for whatever reason, you're not eligible for Medicaid, potentially options if you're a little bit higher income or your young person is for some reason to what are called qualified health plans, meaning subsidized health insurance through the government as well, which can be really, really helpful. That second link there is that there are people called assisters who can help with this application process, both for Medicaid and for those qualified health plans. And that's the link there to get help from an assister to navigate the website or answer sort of questions about health insurance and eligibility and things like that. Okay. So for Washington Apple Health, the main eligibility requirement is that in general, you must be low income. Plus, for some elements of the Washington Apple Health program, you also need to have limited resources, meaning assets like bank accounts or property, things like that. As we said before, typically you are automatically eligible for Medicaid if you're on a DDA waiver, which we discussed earlier. And then also if you are on SSI, which is a program that we will discuss in a few minutes, which is a cash benefit through the Federal Social Security Administration. Something to be aware of, and this is the same as for SSI that we'll discuss in a minute, is that for the purposes of Medicaid, when someone turns age 18, their parents' income and resources are no longer considered for that young person who has just turned 18, who is applying for Medicaid. Instead, that young person who just turned 18, even if they're still, living with their parents and kind of part of that family unit, because they turned 18, they're technically under the rules considered to be their own household. Why this is important is that we actually hear sometimes parents saying things like, oh, well, I applied for Medicaid for my kid or whatever like that. And, they weren't eligible. My family income was too high. In that case, we would say, oh, they've turned 18, reapply again, because now it's just going to be their own income that counts. And so even if they were not eligible before, they very likely could be eligible now. Um, and then final question that we do get about Medicaid eligibility sometimes is, if you are found eligible for Medicaid and you're on Medicaid, does that mean that you're kind of just on Medicaid now permanently through the end of time? Or is it more like Medicaid will look every once in a while or ask you for information about whether there's been a change, like in your income or who's in your household or something like that? And the answer is, they do ask for those changes and they do look to those changes to kind of redetermine from time to time if you're still eligible for Medicaid. So even if you're eligible for Medicaid this year, if there is a big life change, and the two biggest usually are things like income, or like if you get married and now you're part of a household with someone else, and so that kind of part of that household composition income changes. Those are the sorts of changes that could potentially that could change your Medicaid eligibility, and that you'll want to make sure that you do report to Medicaid right away if there is a change like that. And then, Kate, another topic that we get a lot of questions about with regards to Washington Apple Health Medicaid eligibility is immigration status requirements for free health insurance coverage through the state. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it is true that most of the medical programs do have immigration status requirements. And so, for example, the federally funded Medicaid program, which is the main Washington Apple Health program, that has restrictions in that only certain categories of immigrants are eligible. And most of those folks also will have to wait 5 years after they get status before they become Medicaid eligible. So that's the program with the most restrictions. There are also some state programs that extend eligibility to other categories of immigrants, and even some immigration applicants. And then finally, Washington State does offer some programs for non-citizens who don't have any immigration status or any immigration application pending, so who are not otherwise eligible for any programs. So in Washington, all children under age 19 are eligible so long as they meet, those other income requirements and so forth. Children above a certain income level who are still sort of moderate income, they may have to pay us, their families may have to pay a small premium, but it's significantly less than private insurance would be. People who are pregnant are eligible, and that continues until 1 year after their pregnancy ends. People can also get emergency treatment in a hospital setting, cancer care, and dialysis. And then starting in July of this year, 2024, Washington will offer medical coverage to adults without immigration status. This is the first program like this in Washington State. It has limited funding, so there's going to be only a limited number of slots available, but that is a big change in Washington State. The other thing just to keep in mind is that starting this year, it's already actually been put into effect. People without status can also access that private insurance referred to as qualified health plans through Health Plan Finder and subsidies to help pay for that.
Kate, I'm also going to ask you about this next slide, and this is a question that's really similar to what we were asking about DDA in terms of, again, we hear from a lot of families and medical providers all saying kind of, do you need guardianship to apply for Medicaid, for Washington Apple Health, or to exchange information with the Washington State Healthcare Authority, that state agency that administers Medicaid? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so once again, guardianship is not required to help somebody apply or to communicate with state agencies. But people who are over 18, in order to give someone else the authority to communicate with the healthcare authority or other state agencies, they would need to sign either a durable power of attorney where if they have the ability to understand that, hey, I want to give this person this authority to make decisions for me or communicate for me, they can do that. And we have a link there to a resource that has a sample power of attorney form that people can use and also just general information. Or they can also use a form that's called an authorized representative designation form. That's that second link there that basically just says this person is designated to be my representative. And parents and others can actually submit that form themselves if the adult child is unable to due to their disabilities. Okay, so next we're going to shift gears and talk about in-home personal care. And just like it sounds, this is caregiver hours where someone comes into the home and provides help with daily tasks of living like laundry, getting dressed, bathing, other hygiene activities, medication management, and so forth. So for in-home personal care, there are two separate aspects of eligibility that have to be met. So the first is functional eligibility. So basically, this is showing that the person does in fact require a minimum level of help with certain tasks, and they are specific tasks, including these main ones that I just referenced: dressing, bathing, medication management, and so forth. And the way this works is that someone from DDA or from Home and Community Services will come to the home and conduct what's called a care tool assessment, where they go through a pretty extensive assessment about all those things. You know, can the person get dressed by themselves? Do they need supervision? And do they need full-on help to do it, and so forth. So that's part of establishing that functional eligibility. Separate from that is financial eligibility. People who are low income will be able to get this service without having to pay anything. People with moderate income may need to pay a portion of the cost, which is referred to as their participation amount. So in order to apply for in-home personal care, if people are on DDA waivers, then the easiest is probably just to ask their DDA case resource manager, and they should be able to help with that. If people don't have a case resource manager, then there's a link on this slide that people can use to apply. For people who are on Medicaid who are not on DDA services, those people can contact their local home and community services office. And the link here allows you to search by county to find which office you should contact. So there are a few things to keep in mind about in-home personal care, and it's really about changes that happen once the young person turns 18. So the biggest change really is that their parents can now become their paid caregiver. Prior to age 18, parents can't be paid. The idea is, you know, parents have to take care of their kids under 18 anyway, so the state is not going to pay them to be a caregiver, but that changes once the person turns 18. Now, anyone who wants to be a paid caregiver does have to go through a background check. They have to meet certain training requirements, and pass tests that are required. So there are certain steps that you have to go through if you're interested in doing this. But if you'd like more information, we have a link to a website that has more information about the process, or you can just talk to the DDA case resource manager or to Home and Community Services to get more information.
Thanks, Kate. And I think one more change that you and I have noted in the past too is that a young person might get significantly more in-home personal care hours when they turn 18, because as you were saying, under age 18, that support that their parents give them that's unpaid is sometimes kind of counted against their hours. But then when they turn 18, there's no longer that presumption. So then you might see a significant bump once they turn 18, which can be really helpful for a lot of families.
Yes, thanks, Ashley. That's right. So now we're going to talk about supplemental security income, or SSI. I'm guessing many people watching this will be very familiar with SSI, but basically what it is, it's a monthly cash assistance program from the Social Security Administration. So this is a federal benefit. Some of the other benefits we've discussed are state benefits, or it's administered by a federal agency, the Social Security Administration. This year, that cash amount is $943 a month for an individual. And keep in mind that most years, not all, but most years, there are cost of living increases. So the amount does go up a small amount most years. So in order to apply for SSI, you can apply online. And we provided a link here. That's probably the easiest way to apply. You can also go in person to a Social Security office if you prefer. Anyone who's been to a Social Security office probably knows there are pretty long lines. You have to go with a fair amount of patience on board, but that is a way you can apply, particularly if you need some help and would like someone to walk through it with you. If an adult SSI applicant is unable to sign or to understand the application, then under Social Security's program rules, a person responsible for their care is allowed to sign on their behalf, and guardianship is not necessary for that, similar to what we discussed previously for Washington Apple Health. So there are eligibility requirements for SSI. First, you do have to have limited income and resources. So the resource limit for individuals is $2,000. And what that means is that looking at all the resources that a person has, and this can include things like money in bank accounts, if they own any real property, things that are of value, those are all considered together. And so it's a fairly low limit there. There has been discussion for years about raising this limit. So I would say try to take a look and see if that limit has gone up, if you're helping someone apply for the first time. But a really critical thing is that after age 18, the parent's income and resources are no longer considered. And that often means that people who previously were not eligible for SSI because of their parent's income will suddenly become eligible when they turn 18. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Another eligibility requirement is that you have to be disabled, 65 or older, or blind. And for disabled, that comes from a definition that you can find on the Social Security website. And it basically looks at whether the person is unable to engage in what they call substantial gainful activity due to some kind of physical or mental condition that can be documented and that has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months or longer. And so for substantial gainful activity, they're really looking at, can you earn enough to basically support yourself and get by? There are also citizenship and immigration status requirements. And social SSI has the strictest immigration status requirements of all of the federal programs. So for many people, that means they will have to become naturalized US citizens before they will be eligible for SSI. There are certain categories of immigrants that enter in what's called a humanitarian status. So that can include people with asylum or refugees. They are eligible for SSI for their first 7 years in status, but they also then will have to become naturalized citizens to remain on SSI after that. So um, some people will have difficulty managing their benefits on their own or communicating with Social Security. And so the Social Security Administration can appoint someone that's called a representative payee to manage the benefits of an adult who's not able to manage their own benefits. And a representative payee has what's called a fiduciary duty. What that means is they have to make sure that the person's SSI benefits are used for that person's care and needs and not on other people's behalf or not for other things. So it's making sure that those benefits are really being used to take care of the person and to do things like buying food and paying the rent and things like that that the person needs for their everyday care. So if you're interested in applying to be a representative payee, you can contact your local Social Security office. You do have to provide a Social Security number, but you do not have to be the person's legal guardian in order to be a representative payee. And in fact, what we often see is that if the adult is on SSI and it's not likely that they're going to have other income or major resources in their lifetime, then often being the representative payee is sufficient to manage their financial affairs, because as the representative payee, you're managing their benefits, you can pay all their bills and so forth. And so that's often all that's really needed. If you'd like more information about the representative payee program, we have a link on this slide. So actually, there is an issue that comes up when an adult child, a child over 18, continues to live with their parents and receiving SSI. Can you talk a little bit about that issue and what families can do to avoid problems with the SSI benefit?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. We obviously hear that question a lot. So, as you were talking about earlier with regards to SSI, one of the eligibility requirements is low income. So there is a financial requirement. And what happens as part of that is that under the Social Security rules, once a young person turns 18, if they're living with their parents or another trusted adult for free, which is obviously a very, typical arrangement that we see, the young person will just continue to live with their parents. But in that case, Social Security will they consider that free rent to basically be income to the adult child, and because of that, they actually reduce the amount of Social Security of the SSI that the adult child is eligible for, because they say, "Listen, we're basically counting this as additional free income to you." So how can families avoid having that happen? And what we recommend is having the parents or trusted adult, whoever the young person is living with, to sign a rental agreement with the young person and to charge them what is called quote unquote fair market rent or fair rental value. And just kind of anecdotally, about the right amount that we've heard of tends to be about $500 per month. And on the resources slide at the end of this presentation, there will be a link to a webpage that has, among other resources, kind of a sample rental agreement that families can use for that. Just an additional note for the for the parents is that when they do charge their child rent like that and they start getting that income, that actually is taxable income for the parents. So they might want to consult their own tax representative or financial consultant or kind of whoever they use about the implications of that. But that is a tip in order to kind of keep all of that money to support the young person instead of having it be reduced, the SSI amount reduced. And now I actually would like to ask you, Kate, another question about a problem that we see families sometimes face, which is bank account problems. Particularly, if a parent or other trusted adult maybe is the representative payee or is helping the young person manage their funds. And it seems like that there can be a number of issues with those accounts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really critical that the bank account that those SSI funds go into, and usually that is like direct deposit from Social Security, though that bank account should only have those funds in it. You shouldn't ever put other funds into the account because that can cause other problems. The other thing is just keeping in mind, right, that there's that $2,000 resource limit. You don't want that account to be linked to other accounts because that can also cause problems where it can appear that the person actually is over the resource limit. The other thing is that you shouldn't really have a joint account with a person, but you can go to the bank and open an account where if you're the rep payee that you're listed, and it will, it will have the account will have a title noting that you're the representative payee, but it's distinct from if you just had a joint account with the person. So that's really critical. Finally, just as we referenced earlier, if someone's on SSI, then they also are automatically eligible for Medicaid, which is really an important benefit. So this last slide on SSI, it's the last slide. This basically just gives you some information on one slide about the difference between SSI for adults and SSI for kids. And the thing to be aware of is that so if you have a child that's been on SSI as a child, as they get close to age 18, you're going to be getting notices from Social Security saying, okay, now we're going to do this redetermination because we now need to figure out, are they eligible for SSI under the adult standard, which is different from the child standard. There are some similarities, but it is a different standard. So just looking at this little chart, you can see that before age 18, the parent's income and resources are counted. That's not true after age 18. The applicant's own income and resources are counted both before and after age 18. But then a really big difference is the standard that's applied. So for children, the Social Security Administration is looking to see if the child has physical or mental conditions that seriously limit their activities. So it's kind of a functional test that they're applying. After age 18, Social Security is looking to see if the person is unable to engage in substantial gainful work. So they have a physical or mental condition that prevents them from earning a minimum level of income that will allow them to support themselves. So it's really the focus on sort of ability to be employed and to earn a minimum level of income. And then for both, the disability needs either to have already lasted or be expected to last for at least 1 year.
So, Kate, as you and I both know, as attorneys that often work with young adults and their parents in these sorts of situations, we've seen a lot of kind of roadblocks and problems that that parents and their children run into. We have addressed a lot of those already in this presentation, but some really good overarching tips to help with to avoid problems with public benefits is the first is to really read the applications and requests for information carefully and provide complete information on the applications for all of these benefits. When they send you notices asking for more information, make sure that you understand what's being asked or supplying the information that's being asked, everything like that. And then, to the extent possible, learn the rules of the benefits programs, including what you need to report and when. As you saw, a lot of these programs do have rules around disability, around income, around household composition, those sorts of things. And if the information that the agency administering the benefits has is not up to date or not accurate, that can result in a number of different problems, including potentially them asking you to repay them if they think that you received benefits that you were not entitled to. And really, in those sorts of cases, and Kate and I see those cases sometimes, your best defense can often be if you can show, listen, I reported what I needed to report, and really it's on you that you kind of didn't update your system, but I was doing what I needed to. And that really goes to that last bullet point there, which is that when you report your changes to the agency, especially those changes in income or other significant changes like who's in the household or something like that, try to do it as soon as possible, and then keep a date stamped photocopy of what you submitted so that if there is a problem in the future, you have proof of what you told the agency at that point. And then that third bullet there, which just is expect and know that these programs generally do have those eligibility reviews from time to time. Supply them with the information that they know, don't ignore them, and keep an eye out for it, to keep everything running smoothly. Two other tips for receiving benefits, and these are really more rights that you have as a recipient or an applicant of these programs. The first is if there are any reasonable accommodations that you or your adult child need, uh, in a program. So in order to kind of comply with those rules that we were talking about before, in order to report changes or things like that, or kind of anything else, or maybe you need all notices to be sent to you in a much larger font, or maybe to be read to you over the phone because you are low vision or vision impaired, you have low vision or you are vision impaired. You can ask for those sorts of changes to accommodate your disabilities, to make sure that you understand what's going on, and if there's confusion, that can be cleared up. So if there's anything that could be changed or be done differently, don't hesitate to ask the agency to make those sorts of changes, especially when it's tied to your disability or the disability of your adult child. The other is that if you are limited English proficiency or you don't speak English, you are entitled to free interpretation and translation services. Um, and um, and so that is something that you should ask for. It's something that you should make sure is delivered, and it's a really important right that you have as a recipient or applicant to these programs.
So, Ashley, if somebody gets a notice that affects their benefits, like maybe a notice, maybe denying them the benefit or terminating it or saying we're going to reduce it, or hey, we paid you too much, now you have to pay us back, what can they do?
So that's a really, really good question, Kate. And the first thing is that generally, before an agency is going to take any sort of action, they're required to send you a notice in writing. Um, and that's really, really important because sometimes communication with agencies can seem more informal. And if you have a question and you feel like some sort of a what's called adverse action is being taken, or you got like notification of it like by the phone or just verbally, something like that, it's your right to ask for that to be in writing along with the rules that they use to make that decision and whatever facts that they think that they have that support their decision to take that adverse action against you. So ask for that. Ask to get a written notice if you haven't gotten a written notice. And then on that written notice, there should be included information about deadlines and how to appeal, meaning to protest that decision and have someone else look at it, even some sort of an administrative judge in most instances who can decide. There might be an opportunity to present evidence, those sorts of things, to really have a fair and impartial decision maker understand what's going on and decide, is that action that the agency is proposing to take, is that the right action or not. And Kate, that you and I, for years and years, we both worked on these sorts of issues. And a lot of families feel very um when they're up against an agency that says, listen, we're terminating you or we're taking this other adverse action. Often families don't fight because they say, well, they're the ones with the information. I guess they must just be right. But as you and I know, uh, in our experience, that's very often not the case. And getting additional information and appealing is usually what we would recommend in the best course of action. That final bullet there is, don't delay though, because often there are short deadlines for these sorts of appeals or to preserve certain rights. Um, and that's especially true for the case of what's called continuing benefits, which means that for things where you were getting some sort of benefit, like let's say SSI or something like that, and now it's going to be stopped or it's going to be reduced. If you appeal within a very short period of time and say, yes, I want some continuing benefits, then those benefits should continue at the old level that they were at during the appeal during the appeal process, which for many families can be really, really important while everything is getting sorted out, right? In terms of being able to just pay basic bills and things like that. So now we've gone through all of the public benefits programs, and our final topic today is financial planning and public benefits. So many families understandably ask, why do I need to worry about financial planning for my young person? Um, and the reason is that for so many of the programs that we talked about today, as you saw, there are those income and resource limits. And eligibility is partially based on a person being low income and with limited resources. So if their income or financial resources are too high, they may no longer be eligible for these programs. However, there are financial tools that families can use to help people remain eligible for benefits and to prevent eligibility problems. So there are two basic types of financial planning instruments that we're going to talk about in this presentation. And really, this is just a 30,000 foot view, a very, very broad summary. And there are links to websites with more information, and we'll talk about kind of professionals or organizations to talk to more about this. This is really just general awareness about what these are so that you can go out and get more information about what might be suitable for your and your family's situation. But the first type of financial planning instrument is called a special needs trust. And that's both the blue box there and the orange box that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So a special needs trust is a special type of financial account called a trust account. It is generally set up by a private attorney, and it usually mostly comes into play if a person with disabilities, let's say that they receive a lump sum of money, a sizable lump sum of money. So that could be like, let's say, a gift or an inheritance, or maybe like a settlement from a lawsuit, an accident, something like that. And now there's this lump sum of money. Whereas if they just kind of kept it and spent it, they would be ineligible for those programs like SSI and Medicaid for some period of time. Instead, if that money is put into and set up by a private attorney into a special needs trust financial account, that money won't count against then the public benefits, and that person can maintain the eligibility. A couple of good things to know generally about special needs trust accounts. So the first is that the person with disabilities, the young person, cannot have direct access to the funds in that account. Instead, what happens is that someone who is called the administrator of the account, kind of like the manager of the special needs trust, they actually take money from that account and directly pay it to third parties for the benefit of the young person with disabilities. So if there are activities or classes or technology or just other things that that young person needs that are permissible things to be used for this account, then the trust administrator would actually pay those third parties for those things. The money in a special needs trust cannot be spent on food and shelter. Um, and that is because that's what SSI is supposed to be used for. Now, that orange box there, the Developmental Disabilities Endowment Trust Fund, that is actually a specific type of special needs trust, which is administered by the ARC of Washington, a nonprofit organization, specifically for people who are on DDA, which is another good reason to be on DDA. And the main benefit of that trust fund is that it's not set up by a private attorney. Instead, it's just through the ARC, and the setup costs and then those yearly administration costs are much less expensive than a typical special needs trust that is set up by a private attorney. And so that's something to look into if you think that your young person might be eligible and this might be a good fit for them. The other type of financial planning instrument different from special needs trusts is ABLE accounts. ABLE accounts were established by the federal government back in the 2010s and then came to Washington state just within the last few years. And you can learn a lot more, plus begin that process of starting up your ABLE account through that Washington State able.com website listed there. And an ABLE account is more like a bank account, but it needs to be set up through that website. It can't just be any old bank account. And then once that bank account is set up, the young person might put in their SSI every month because ABLE accounts are only available to people on SSI whose disability originated before age 26. But the person might put their SSI in there every month. They can also get certain amounts of like gifts from money gifts from other people, put that in the account, that sort of thing. Although there are limits on the yearly contributions that can be made and the amounts in the account. And then the money in that account really can be used on what are called qualified disability expenses, which is fairly broad. You'll get more information at that website. And the money in that account can be used on food and shelter in contrast to the special needs trust account. People can have both a special needs trust and an ABLE account at the same time. And for many people, they find that to be beneficial. But really, you'll want to investigate it more, talk to appropriate professionals to kind of figure out what is the best fit for you and your family's situation. So this is our final slide today, which is our resources slide, and kind of just goes back through a lot of the resources that we referred to throughout this presentation, as well as some supplemental resources that you might find helpful. So the first is WashingtonLawHelp.org. That's a website run by Northwest Justice Project, where Kate and I are attorneys, and they have hundreds and hundreds of really helpful self-help publications, forms, information on all sorts of legal topics. So a lot of the topics that we are talking about today with public benefits and a lot of other things, and then also things like the durable power of attorney forms and things like that. In addition to that, there's also information on housing law, on eviction, on all sorts of law. And it's a really, really wonderful resource. And we encourage you to really check it out and explore a little bit more. The second website there is informingfamilies.org, which has a lot of resources about DDA and does a really deep dive into a lot of aspects of DDA, the specific programs, eligibility, waivers, everything like that, where we were really giving the high level view today, a lot more detailed information. The third resource there is the Arc of Washington website, which is really a great connection point for the families of people with disabilities in Washington and getting a lot of supports and resources, highly recommended. And then the last website there is a link to a page on the Seattle Children's Hospital website, seattlechildrens.org, and then the other things you need to type in that you see there. And what that page is that they have a web page titled "Your Child with Disabilities is Turning 18," and then a lot of resources. So on that page specifically, among resources you'll find are that video that Kate and I referred to about guardianship and power of attorney and other legal decision making for young people with disabilities who are turning 18. And then also specifically that resource, the sample rental agreement to avoid the 1/3 reduction in SSI. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take care. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.